Hi, Misha here, and this will be a pretty quick one. Have another Japanese 1/72 scale diecast model. This is one from, actually, Atlas, because they were the only ones I could find that even did this model. This is the Nakajima KI-43 Oscar. At least Oscar was its Allied reporting name. It was also called Peregrine in Japan, and the Army Zero by Allied pilots, because this is in a lot of ways the land-based version of the A6M0. It has much of the same features and drawbacks, and was a very prevalent fighter for the Japanese Army during the War in the Pacific. This started off in 1937 when the Japanese Army put out a request for a new fighter to replace the KI-27, so-called Nate. The new fighter needed to be able to get up to at least 311 miles per hour, and it needed to be as maneuverable or better than the Nate. You know, just in a more modern design. For example, the Nate had a fixed landing gear. Obviously, the new one would need retractable. And since Nakajima had kind of passed on the Zero, leaving that to Mitsubishi, they embarked on this, with their first prototype flying in January of '39, and frankly, it kind of sucked. It wasn't a whole lot faster than the existing plane, but the original prototype wasn't as maneuverable. So throughout 1939 and into 1940, they made over a dozen different prototypes, kind of tweaking the design. They would use different engines, they would redesign the flaps, they would go to a different canopy. In the end, what they came up with was a good fighter. It was light and agile. Initial versions could get up to a little under 310 miles per hour. Later versions could get almost up to 330. Had a ceiling of 36,000 feet. It was under 30 foot long, about 29 feet and some change. Had a wingspan of 35.5 feet. And, yeah, it was just a really good, agile little fighter. The first ones were, they put these into production in very late '39, but the very first ones didn't start to be delivered to the Army until February of 1941, and the first squadrons were formed around them the summer of that year, and then they first were put into combat in China in October of '41, so just a couple of months before Pearl Harbor. This was, as I said, a land-based fighter. And they would produce these at a total of 3 factories, although one of them only made a few before production was canceled. They would make over 5,900 during the war. And this model here, the Oscar, was responsible for shooting more Allied aircraft down than any other Japanese fighter in the Pacific. So it was a successful design in that sense. But it was far from perfect. I'm not going to get into all the variations, but the original KI-43I, specifically the IA, had 2 7.7mm machine guns in the fuselage, So, yeah, not terribly heavily armed. Then the IB would go to one 12.7 millimeter, which would be 50 caliber machine gun, and one 7.7. Of course, the problem there is you have two different guns with two different points of aim and all that. And then the IC would go to two 12.7 millimeter, which was reasonably okay for early on in the war. However, the plane suffered kind of the same issues as the Zero. It did not have self-sealing fuel tanks. It was very lightly armored with a very kind of lightly armored cockpit. And they did this to get the maneuverability and speed they wanted, so it was a sacrifice. So these are perhaps hard for Allied pilots to hit, but if they just hit them a few times, they would break apart or burst into flames. So it didn't take many hits, and of course early on, up against planes like the F-4F, this was very acceptable. But as newer designs like the P-38 and F-6F and F-4U came online, yeah, this was getting dated. To that end, in 1942, early in the year, they would test fly the KI-43-2 and put it into production at the end of the year. The second variation would introduce later on a more powerful engine. It would start to put some armor around the cockpit, at least more than was there. They would also strengthen the wings and give better support for bombs or drop tanks from the wings. And they would do some kind of rudimentary self-sealing fuel tanks. Basically, they would kind of cover the fuel tanks in rubber. First, just one coat, and then eventually 3 coats of rubber, which was better than nothing, but still not as good as a true self-sealing tank. This would also give way to the KI-43-3, which would have a more uprated engine. And the final version, or at least one of the close to being final versions of this, would replace the two 50 caliber machine guns with two 20mm cannon in the fuselage. But I don't think that many were made because it came out very late in the war. And while these are getting dated by 1944 and into 45, they were still making kills against Allied aircraft. They weren't completely useless, that's for sure. And as with the Zero, in 44 and 45, many Oscars were used as kamikaze planes. And some of these would remain in service in various East Asian countries after the war. Thailand, Indochina, mainland China. But as with most Japanese planes, their service after the war was quite limited. And of course, newer models were coming online, making this look dated. And there you have the KI-43 Oscar. As to this model from Atlas, I was pretty surprised. These are priced about the same as an Oxford. And this one came with removable drop tanks. It has landing gear for up or down. It has spinning propeller. And generally speaking, a pretty solid construction. So, considering I wasn't expecting much, I was happy this one did have more features than, say, Oxford. Not bad at all, considering this is kind of the only option in the 1/72 scale diecast total. This is it. And I've got several Zeros, and it always seemed fitting to try to get an Oscar. Well, folks, if you have any questions or comments, please do post them below. If you could, like, share, and subscribe, and maybe check out some of the other videos. This is Misha. And hard to get this going. I will catch you very soon next time.